Hi folks, welcome to my channel. In today's video, which I'm posting a bit earlier than my usual upload day due to Christmas, I'm painting a snowy white deer scene and I'm going to be using white watercolour. I'm painting my winter watercolour on the Arches rough paper and I'll be using Dr. Ph Martins HYDRUS watercolours, including the white one. But all the items I use today I will list in the description box if you want to go and check them out. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Hit the bell icon as well if you'd like to be notified as soon as I upload a new video. The painting I'm doing today may also feature in my 500 subscriber giveaway, which I'll tell you more about after Christmas. So with that all said, let's jump into this painting. Now, using white watercolour is possibly a bit controversial, as some people might feel that white watercolour is either not very good or shouldn't be used, as it's better to preserve the white of the paper in watercolour paintings. Instead, a lot of people will favour white gouache to add highlights and so on at the end of the painting. Gouache is an opaque watercolour which I like to use myself for adding bright white highlights and for mixing in with transparent watercolours as well to make them more opaque. But I didn't want to use gouache today because my aim was to try and create a blurry, snowy background for my deer to live in, and so I thought I'd experiment a bit with white watercolour. For the foreground though, I wanted to preserve some of the white of the paper, so figured I would try and create this snowy piece without using gouache at all. So let's just talk a bit about the properties of Dr. Ph Martins HYDRUS white watercolour. Now, Dr. Ph Martins' website describes its white HYDRUS watercolour as titanium white in colour and as transparent. This, you may think, is slightly conflicting information, since titanium white watercolours are usually more opaque than, say, Chinese white watercolours. So what's the deal? Well, I highly recommend you check out Lindsay the Frugal Crafter's video on white watercolour, as she explains very thoroughly all about the different pigments and so on, and I'll put a link up in the card above to that video if you want to go and check that out. Generally speaking though, there are two main white watercolours that you might find in your watercolour palette or tube. They are Chinese white and titanium white. Put simply, Chinese white is more transparent than titanium white, and because of the different white pigments used in them, they can be useful for different things, depending on what you are painting and what effects you want to achieve. The problem arises though where some paint companies call their white paint Chinese white when they actually contain the PW6 pigment, which is titanium white. Titanium white is a cooler white and tends to give off more of a blue hue, so it's worth taking a look at which pigments are in your paints before you try them in your paintings. So the Dr. Ph Martins HYDRUS white watercolour is titanium white, and whilst more opaque than Chinese white, is still not as opaque as my Winsor & Newton white gouache. So, using it in the background of this painting was a bit of an experiment, but I like experimenting with different techniques and started out just by introducing a few spots of neat white onto my still wet background. At this point, with the painting so far now dry, I also decided to apply some Frisket film to my deer to protect him before adding any paint splatters. I should really have applied this at the start, as it would have made applying the initial wash a lot easier, but I'll remember that for next time. This Frisket film is a really good way to mask out larger areas though, which would otherwise use up a lot of the more traditional masking fluids. You do need to be careful cutting it out though, as you don't want to damage your paper. Once it was applied though, I could go in with a wash of indigo colour and add a bit more depth and contrast to the trees in the background. Because the paper was wet, these colours bled together nicely to achieve that blurry effect I was after. With the paper still wet, it was then time to add some of the white watercolour to the background. I used it neat out of the bottle and used a cheap stiff bristle brush to add some white splatters. To add bigger splatters and a more dramatic effect, I did add a small amount of water to the paint in my palette, and being pretty transparent, the white blended into and mixed with the other still wet colours on the background to create the misty, snowy effect I was after. Next, while the paper was still damp, I went in and added some more white watercolour to the right side of a few of the trees to build in a bit more contrast on areas where the light was coming through. With this done, I then used a fine paintbrush to add in some white branches to the background to help add depth, as I wanted the wooded area behind the deer to appear a bit more dense. After this, and with the paper now dry, I switched over to a number 1 liner brush to add in some twigs and branches to the foreground. I also used this to add definition to some of the white branches I painted in before to try and make them stand out as being topped with snow. I carried on using the liner brush to add in more branches to the foreground, using more concentrated colours of sepia and burnt sienna, and mixing in a bit of indigo and Paynes Grey to work in with the cool colour tones that I'd used in the background. Layering darker colours in the front like this really helped give the piece depth, and having the Frisket film masking off the deer enabled me to make sure the branches carried on through from one side of the deer to the next to maintain continuity. So despite this piece being a bit experimental, I really enjoyed the whole process. For me, painting backgrounds has always been a bit of a challenge, but because I didn't have any high hopes or expectations, the whole process was fun and exciting. With the background sorted, it was time to add some details to the area of snow underneath the deer's feet. And like I said earlier, I really wanted to preserve some of the white of the paper here, so just added a bit of a very diluted indigo under the branches to ground them, as well as a few sprigs of grass to complete the look. Once this was complete, it was time to work on the deer. Unfortunately, when I removed the Frisket film, you can see that some of the indigo did manage to seep underneath, but I think that's because I didn't push it down well enough in the start, as it's usually really effective, but it wasn't drastic, and luckily it was on an area that I was going to paint darker anyway. I did work from a reference photo for this piece, and on this reference photo the deer's head and back were covered in snow, and being that I was in an experimental sort of mood, I thought I'd add some salt to these areas to add in a bit of texture, and in order for this to show up, I painted the top of the deer's head in quite a dark burnt sienna with some Paynes Grey in there as well. So I thought the darker paint would show up the salt effect well, and so applied a generous sprinkling of table salt to the deer's head and left it to work whilst I carried on with the rest of the head and body. For the most part, I used the wet on wet method for the body, as I love to watch colours mixing together on the paper, and I didn't really focus too much on individual hairs. When I got to the top of the deer's back, I added another generous sprinkling of salt, and as before left it to work whilst I carried on with the rest of the deer. I really liked adding some warmer colours to the piece with the more red hues of the Venetian Brown and the Hansa Yellow on his legs. I also like the contrast between the warmer orangey tones of the deer compared to the complementary blue hues of the background. So for the most part, I was really pleased with how this piece turned out. The salt experiment, however, was a bit of a fail, as it didn't have much effect at all, which was a bit disappointing. Maybe I was too impatient and didn't let it dry properly, or maybe the area I tested it on wasn't big enough to show up. I also think that in order for this technique to work well, you need to have wetter paint, as the salt works by absorbing some of the water, and although I'd added quite a concentrated amount of paint, hadn't added much water. In any case, it's something that I'll be practicing and experimenting with maybe in a future video. I also think this technique works better with some colours than others, and some salt works better than others too, but I'll have to try it out. If anyone can offer any helpful hints and tips, then do let me know in the comments box below. In the end though, being determined not to use whitewash, I decided I'd just add some neat white watercolour straight out of the bottle for the deer's snow-covered head and back, and although not perfect, I thought it would work out okay. So in conclusion, salt aside, I was pretty pleased with how this painting turned out, and using the white watercolour really helped me achieve the misty, snowy forest background that I'd hoped for. What I would suggest though is, if you want to experiment with your own white watercolours, whether they are in pans or tubes and whether they are labelled Chinese white or titanium white, that you do some small thumbnail sized test pieces first, since as I said earlier, some Chinese whites do still contain the PW6 titanium white pigment, like my Holbein Chinese white and my Mission Gold Chinese white, and this can have an effect on both opacity and hue. Get to know how your white watercolours behave and have fun with trying them out to create misty forests, pastel romantic sunsets, or whatever you like. There is no rule to say that using white watercolour means you're a bad artist, and I think every colour has a use somewhere. Personally, I think using the white watercolour today, although experimental, has taught me lots of lessons and given me a whole new dimension to think of when doing my paintings. I managed to use the white watercolour to cover the deer's back, albeit not as opaquely as gouache, but I also managed to add some nice white details that kind of blended it in with the painting a little bit more, as you can see me doing here, and I think that gives it a really nice different effect. So last of all, to finish this painting, I added some more splatters with the Hydrus white watercolour just to finish it off. I hope you've enjoyed this painting and maybe found it useful in some way. Have a wonderful week, whether you're busy with family or friends, or whether you're enjoying some peace and maybe a day or two off work. But whatever you're doing, take care, look after yourself, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, see you soon, bye.